Thanks, everyone. Good to see you all. I think we'll probably have a few people joining us, and we'll just let them in as and when they get here. It's good to be with you all. This session is a practical session on silence to safety, a practical guide for HR leaders. For those of you who attended the session with Jen and I, where we ran 2 sessions last year in person, I think we found that the appetite for this topic was certainly high. There was a lot of misconceptions across sector, what we do, where we work. That was really interesting to peel back some of those layers. I'm sure you would agree, Jen.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we're here today to really focus on those practical tips. The webinar is going to be in 2 parts. So myself and Jen are going to be taking the first part, which will be a bit of a recap on psych safety and some of the journey to how this world tour commenced, Jen, which is going well. The tickets have sold quite well, so maybe we'll get another gig out of this.
We'll see.
But in all seriousness, this is, your development. If you are listening to us on a walk, if you're there in person at work or at home, feel free to use the chat functionality for commentary as we go. You will notice that the Q&A function is enabled, and when we get to the Ask Amanda Anything segment, we will be using the Q&A functionality to share some of those questions. We have received some questions already in advance, so some people were keen to get those questions in. If the Q&A functionality doesn't work, because I think it depends on which device that you're on, please do use the chat functionality. Just so we know that you can see us and hear us okay, would everyone who's attending so far just drop into the chat a very quick hello and just let us know where you are joining from? That would be really nice. So yeah, just use the chat functionality, very quick hello, and yeah, let us know where you're joining from, just so we know that everything is working okay. So again, as I mentioned, we do have the session, which is a practical session. It's not a deep dive, but it is intended to help you decide on what to do next, or certainly how you can help your leaders as well. So what we're going to do is do some very quick introductions. Many of you will know me and Jen in other aspects of our work, but we do some introductions because we appreciate not everyone knows who we are. So I'm Scott, business owner of PeopleSpark, and my business is there to help businesses be high performing and healthy, which means lots of different things to lots of different people. And my obsession / curiosity about psych safety started about 4 years ago, when actually I was using some of Amanda's tools and thought, oh, this looks quite interesting. And in another hat of mine, as a volunteer of my local CIPD branch, at the beginning of last year, we had a knowledge exchange with the 4 main universities in the Northeast. And actually, academics and practitioners in this knowledge exchange, the conclusions were all roads lead back to psychological safety, which was really interesting. But also I wanted to dig a little bit deeper with it, hence the ongoing conversations I had with Jen around this topic, and what started this, I suppose, development opportunity last year. So that's a little bit about me. Jen, over to you.
I will introduce myself as well. Hi, everyone. I'm Jen. I'm the head of professional services at Hive. I've been at Hive now for about 7.5 years, but before that, I worked in HR, a generalist, L&D, the whole space. At Hive, we're obviously known for our employee voice platform, but contrary to what people tend to think about technologies like that, we don't believe that ours is a silver bullet for psychological safety, and if anything, I think that's really why my role in my team exists. So yeah, coming at this with a bit of a different stance. Tech isn't the answer on its own, but I do think it can reveal a lot around psychological safety, especially when combined with other data. And I think that's where I'm starting to see a lot of organisations stretch their interest to beyond just what we're hearing back in things like surveys, to understanding where trust might be a little bit lower, where people might be holding back, or where something isn't quite right. So I think that's really where a lot of my interest comes from, helping organisations collecting feedback, actually understanding it, being able to critique it, and acting in a way that builds trust over time and ultimately improves the quality of the information that they're getting back as well. So nice to see everyone, and we'll get into a bit more of that as we go through as well.
And actually, you've reminded me, Jen, that whilst my work cuts across all sectors, I'm particularly interested and may have a question for Amanda later on about those organisations that are in high stakes, high growth, where there's a lot of focus on the numbers. How can we have high psychological safety? Can we, where do we start? So my particular interest in this is around that environment, but we'll come to that, no doubt.
Yeah, we better get some Q&A in the chat, otherwise it'll just be me and you asking Amanda loads of questions.
Yeah, good point. Please do keep using the chat functionality for commentary as we go. We love to see it. And the Q&A functionality is enabled to capture those questions. So on to today's proceedings. So that today, or certainly in part one, Jen and I will be taking you through these three things. We're going to look at how to run a safety audit, some of those managerial micro habits and feedback loops. This isn't a fix your culture in 90 minutes session, and it's not a comprehensive overview of psych safety. What we are doing is shifting, because in the face-to-face sessions last year, we did do a live voting on what it is that people wanted, and these were the things that came out of that discussion. So we aim to please. So that's what we're going to be covering today. So part one, very much around those practical tips, and perhaps give you something different to think about as well. So we did promise, I kind of almost announced at the last session that we might have Amanda, even though I'd not asked Amanda, but I kind of got carried away with that. That did happen. But I am really pleased to have Dr. Amanda Potter with us today to take part in the Ask Amanda Anything in the second part of the webinar. Amanda, you're here, so how about you introduce yourself just briefly to everybody? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Scott. Thanks, Jen. So I did put a little comment in the chat just to say hi. So as it says here, Amanda, I'm now 26 years into running Zircon, which has now been titled Be Talent, because we are a psychometric organisation. We research, design and build suites of tools around resilience, psychological safety, strengths, decision making and others. And our whole ethos is about identifying the gap that organisations have, that they're trying to understand, or the challenge they're trying to understand in order to drive performance. And then we help to build technology enhanced tools to enable that growth or that change or the improvement against the challenge. And so I host the Chief Psychology Officer podcast. My passion is psych safety. The other passion is resilience. So I'll be talking about that a little bit today. And I have been reading through those questions. They're tricky. So you're making me work for it. So that's good. And I'm really looking forward to just meeting some of you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Amanda. Great. So we'll be coming back to that question bank a little bit later, but I suppose a little bit of a recap in terms of how we got to this point. We know that, or certainly me and Jen spoke about in our face-to-face sessions, that Amy Edmondson did popularise. Jen, would you agree?
Didn't come up with it, but definitely got it into the zeitgeist, I think.
Yes, and just to keep the engagement going in the chat, just to check that we are paying attention and not doing other things. Does anyone know when Amy Edmondson did popularise psych safety? We don't have any prizes today. For those of you who will remember on our myth busting bingo in person, we did have Percy Pigs and Reversey Percy's which ended up being quite a debate over which one was best.
Yeah.
But yes, Jen, what we're seeing on the chat around timelines and things.
Let me see if we got anybody. 96, 99. I think are the two. I think, well, now 99's been mentioned by Amanda in there, where
Nice. Well, I can see, I think there's Famida said, actually, does it go back to the 1960s? I do think it did go back to the 60s when it was first written about, but perhaps we can talk a little bit more about that in part 2 as well. I didn't say you were right, Famida, you said yay, but actually, I think you are, so you win. Reversey Percy's in the post. So yeah, the myth busting bingo that we did do, and it was actually a live bingo session with prizes. It did help bring out some of those myths of what we all have in terms of perceptions of psych safety in our environments as well. So that was really interesting. We did use the B talent model of psych safety and the card sort to look at those high and low components of psych safety. And what was really interesting, we don't know what this means, but in the 2 sessions, the first session did narrow it down to trust, personal connection and purpose, which was interesting because I know that's what some of what Amanda's research shows. But also the second group was a complete mixed bag and lots of difference there. So perhaps, there might be something in there around environment as well. And Jen, I know we spent a bit of time looking at trust and psychological safety from some of the CIPD research.
Yeah, well, that was the first session that we did was actually hosted for the Northeast CIPD event. So naturally, we looked at some of their materials and their definitions, and they had done a paper about the differences between trust and psychological safety because they are often quite interchangeable and people use both terms quite a lot. And their definition I thought was quite interesting because they talked about trust as personal. So it's my willingness to be vulnerable, to give someone the benefit of the doubt, whereas psychological safety is a bit more about that climate, that environment, and it's whether or not I believe others will give me the benefit of the doubt when I take that risk. So simply it's, will I take the risk and what will happen if I do? And we sort of made a bit of a leap, a bit of a connection. I felt at the time when we looked at this, is how closely that really fits with the transactional analysis model by Eric Byrne. So at its simplest, we're trying to create more of those adult to adult interactions at work where people feel like if they speak up, they'll be met with respect, not judgment. So I'm okay, the organization's okay. And it's not just about the individual, it's shaped by how others are showing up in those moments as well. If you remember that, well played from that session. But actually, I noticed, Amanda, in your podcast episode 89 with Professor Adrian Furnham, you do also go into that individual sign and look at a bit like attachment theories and things like that, and how that can all play a part in psychological safety as well. So if anyone does want to have a little bit more of a look into it, then that would be a great episode of Amanda's podcast to get into a bit more detail on that. But that's all I'll say about it for now, because this is a recap, I suppose.
Absolutely. And one thing to mention, which I didn't mention at the beginning, is all the slides and resources, of which there are a lot. Amanda was very generous with some of her resources as well. We've got our own. So you will be getting a lot of information after this to share amongst your team. So yeah, just to let you know, you will get the slides. Great, that's our recap. So today is all about taking it into a deeper layer, if you will. We spent a lot of time in the first couple of sessions looking at buzzword proportions of psych safety, but now what we want to do is to really look at how to spot psychological safety, but also how you can measure it and keep an eye on it, want of a better word. So again, perhaps some compliments here, Amanda. This quote here I particularly liked because I think what it does do is it takes us back to business performance and sustainable business performance, risk taken, being honest and contributing fully. And it is, it's funny enough, actually, when you mention about resilience, one of the things that I see in my practice, particularly around coaching and leadership development, is you can't have high psychological safety without resilience in your leadership. And I see it where leaders are potentially on the road to burnout. The decision making gets a bit clouded, memory recall, and all of the stuff around risk taking can be a bit tricky to navigate. So I often laugh with Vicky, who I work with, that we want, and we are going to do it actually, is we're going to get T-shirts printed with the important one-to-ones are so important and critical, because some of the basics around connection and purpose and roles and responsibilities, how can you not have that without having those deeper conversations? And some of the things that I've seen just this year, I know we're nearly at the end of Q1, but some of the things that I've heard across a range of organisations is we don't have time for one-to-ones, we're too busy. We don't have conflict in our teams, which again is really interesting, usually comes from the leader. We don't have objectives because we don't pay bonuses, and everyone knows what to do here. Again, bit of a red flag around some of those main components. Two other bits around I'm not taking part, whether that's in development or team activities, or I'm not part of this. And whether it's psychologically removing themselves and isolating themselves from the team, I've just found, which is really interesting. Me and Jen were talking last night about this, not that we're obsessed or anything, but the question that we ended up with was, what's really going on here? Is it about understanding that everyone has a voice in this, but also, do we have late adopters? In one of those examples, we did have one person who was a late adopter, which was great. The resultant fact is one person was, I think you used the term laggard, Jen, where actually by not being part of something, they've completely isolated themselves. Why is that? So yeah, anything to add, Jen?
Yeah, I guess part of what we talked about is sometimes when you hear these things coming back in organisations, it could be a little bit of cognitive dissonance going on there, where people are maybe trying to justify why they're not doing certain things because things aren't feeling comfortable for them. And by that, we just mean where something is clashing with maybe their value system and their beliefs and how they work and things. And so try and quickly steer that away of, oh, we don't have time. Or, we often hear in organisations, people say things like, well, a lot of it in my day, we didn't have this, or we didn't have these things, therefore it's not needed, we don't need to listen, and all of those kind of things. And sometimes it's just those kind of clashes and values going on. I will explain later that laggard term, because I don't want anyone to think that I was slagging off somebody that Scott was working with or something. So if it's not a familiar term, I will get into that model later on and share with you where that came from. Yeah,
but it actually did bring us full circle, actually, yes. Jen, which was, what conversations are we having, with our team? And you reminded me of something. We were working with a public sector client, Midlands, and they effectively had to make quite a significant amount of cuts to a team that had never seen any change in their existence, 20 plus years. And the leader of that team was still going to be the leader of that team, but the setup of that team in terms of leadership completely changed. What was interesting, and I'm going back to feedback loops here, so there's a little bit of peppering of feedback, because I think that is fundamental here in terms of what we're talking about. We were doing some development work, and we had one-to-ones with all of the new team. And actually what the individual said in these conversations, going through a lot of change, was, we're so pleased we've got a leader who we trust. We know and we're on board. It's going to be tough, but we're on board with this. And actually what we did do is, full consent to the individuals. We shared that feedback with the leader, who didn't think that they were doing a good job, because they were so focused on getting the team set up and moving forward, that they didn't create any space for some connection, but also some feedback to say, what am I doing well here? Where could I improve? Some simple and straightforward questions. And the leader was actually quite emotional to say, oh, I'm really pleased you've shared that with us, because as time's been going on, I'm beginning to think I'm not doing a very good job here. So my reason for mentioning that was some of the components around feedback as well.
And making sure we're sharing it, even when it's positive as well, or especially when.
Yes. Psychological safety is a climate. What does that mean, Jen, when we're talking about the word climate? Because I know that might mean different things to different people.
Yeah, it exactly just means it can change, just like the sort of the weather system can. And in this case, we're talking about it can rise and it can fall. It can depend on different things happening in an organization. So change processes, leadership behavior, different workloads and pressures. So it just basically means it's not static. It's not something that you can achieve and it's done. And you're not going to be like, right, we've done psychological safety, let's move on to the next thing. It's always shifting and moving. But I still find it interesting that even though we can acknowledge sometimes that it is a system, a weather front coming in, we still sometimes try and cling on to measuring that climate once a year in a survey, rather than thinking about all of those different interactions that we're having all the way through, but with those feedbacks and all of those changes and the things that contribute towards it as well.
There's some of those micro habits that we've teased out already around whether it's one-on-one conversations, feedback loops, but also just creating some space. Might feel challenging to do when there's a lot of change going on. And actually we were talking yesterday just a little bit about, and with we're not here to talk about politics, of course, who would want to, but the state of the world right now, and actually events over the last even 4 to 6 weeks have probably resulted in businesses having to change their climate change, which has resulted in their climate changing and shifting. So I find that really interesting as well, Jen.
Absolutely. And how organizations are showing up is a signal to their response in these circumstances. We know people who are working in organizations, they've got people working in abroad, so how they're responding to those circumstances are absolutely part of that climate and giving that signal about what really means something to them. I'll kind of get into that in a little bit more, because I want to pause on a tension that many organizations I think will recognize, and it kind of brings in, I suppose, my level of experience and expertise into this. What we often see at Hive is one major engagement survey that happens every year, and sometimes in some cases every couple of years, followed by huge swathes of analysis, lots of time spending on action planning, and then some really big decisions being made off the back of that data that takes people into the next 12 months. But everything we've just been talking about is really signaling that that's not really how work experiences and how our daily interactions are shaped, and psychological safety isn't static. So it'll shift when there's leadership changes, restructures, different workload pressures, uncertainties. When you've got new people coming into the team or people leaving the team, that team dynamic is going to shift. And even, what happened in yesterday's meeting. So what I find interesting sometimes when we take executives through survey data is they'll often signpost and say, oh, well, that team's had a new leader. They've just gone through a restructure. They're under huge delivery pressure. So they're actually communicating that they're recognizing the environment is a factor, and how it's changed and how that factor and how that changes is sort of impacting things. But then they're still really stuck in that idea of we'll only measure and ask about this once a year, and we'll make those decisions on how we're going to shape the rest of our kind of people experience off the back of that one bit of feedback that we get once a year. So one of the things we'll talk about is a bit later on is that listening rhythm. So if psychological safety behaves more like a climate, the real question becomes, what can we actually do with that, and what would be a better way of getting into that? So we've got 3 practical things that we want you to think about for this in terms of our role as an HR practitioner within that. And first is about finding the silence. The second is changing the signals. And then the third is listening in rhythm. This isn't a model. So this is not something we're saying, take this away, do this, and you'll be winning. But it is a practical way for you to think about how you can respond to that changing climate. So if it's something people are experiencing different interactions moment to moment, then this is just 3 ways in which you can help to sort of influence that experience. And we'll start with the first one, obviously, because that is where I think most organisations really can miss out what's going on. So finding the silence. So when we talk about finding the silence, the question we're really asking is, where might people not feel safe to speak openly? And I think at its core for me, it comes down to a principle around if we're trying to understand psychological safety, then we can't rely on a single data point for that. So for example, a low score on its own won't tell you if it's safe for people to speak up, but equally, and I think more interestingly to me, a positive result doesn't automatically mean that things are going well and that people do feel safe to speak up. So the key here is the signal is not the score alone. The signal is the impact that theme is having on overall employee experience, and what else around it suggests that people might be holding back. I've been in these kind of boardroom conversations where execs have looked at engagement data and been like, oh, well, that's a little bit better than what we expected. And I'm not one to want to burst people's bubbles a little bit, but it does make me stop and think, oh, that feels like a bit of a flag, because actually, if you're getting data in other ways through, that's telling you that actually this feels a little bit out of kilter and that maybe things aren't as good as the numbers are indicating, then that's a moment to sort of dig a little bit deeper and understand why that might be the case, because positive scores don't always mean a positive experience. Sometimes it does mean that people are being a little bit cautious and a bit careful with what they're saying. So voice is a great signpost, but it isn't the full picture. So this is really where I want to dig into that audit part. So what are the things that we can do to help find that silence where there might be that people aren't speaking up or they have that fear of speaking up? And for me, it's often where we're starting to see contradictions in signals. So one of them could be where we're getting a bit of an echo chamber. So what we would typically expect is happy people, happy customers, and that is something that has been sort of tried and tested over the years. So if we've got high engagement internally, but we've got a declining customer experience, then this may be something that we want to scratch a little bit, more scratch under the surface on. So usually your frontline colleagues are the ones that are going to see issues with the customer experience before leaders do. So if those concerns are not traveling upwards, then we could have an internal positivity bias. So the question's not, are people not seeing the issues, or is it that they're not seeing the issues or that they're not feeling safe to raise them? And another pattern that we often see is where you get, and Scott and I, we talked about this last night as well, didn't we? Another pattern is where you get strong performance alongside rising burnout, or you get a lot of absenteeism, or people leaving organisations. And this links into what you were talking about in those kind of really high pressure environments where silence almost becomes a bit of a survival strategy. People keep delivering, but they're not challenging the workload or the unrealistic expectations. I think we should be looking, if we've got those kind of environments where we know it's high pressure, but we are seeing people leave, even if performance seems like it's, things are going well, we're hitting our sales targets and things. Do people feel safe to raise concerns before performance becomes unsustainable? So to me, that's another red flag where we've got contradictions in data. Third pattern is when we look like we've got a really healthy team on the surface. So they all get on really well, they've got good relationships, decent engagement results, but we're not seeing high performance or innovation or challenge coming through in that team. So this is where it helps to remember, and going back to the Percy Pigs and the myth busting bingo, psychological safety is not about comfort. It is about having that safety to, you know, be able to challenge. So are you finding teams that are in that nice trap where they're comfortable, they're not comfortable challenging each other? You could, you know, on the surface have some really good data points suggesting that things are going quite well in the team, but really need to sort of look at what else might be going on. Are we still performing well? Are we still driving change and innovation? And then the final one that I want to sort of shine a light on, and this one's a bit of an interesting one, because at Hive, I'm often asked about what kind of internal data points would signal that engagement is going well, and that we've seen a return on investment for you know, investing into our engagement tools and things like that. And I often get asked if well-being scores or absenteeism rates and things like that could be a good signal, but actually for me, I think it's a massive watch out and a big something to be really cautious of and looking at well-being, because sometimes the signal can go the other way. So we've got low well-being paired with high attendance and low absence. It could be that we've got a presenteeism culture, and if people don't feel safe speaking up and saying I'm not coping, and they're coming into work anyway, that could be an indication. So are people safe about their safe to be honest about their capacity? Do they feel like they have to push through? And that can happen in lots of different cultures and different types of organisations, and organisations at different parts of their journey as well. Scott, did you have anything?
Yeah, I think what comes to mind here, referring back to the B talent model, is relentless expectations, but also the challenge that we face as practitioners, where sometimes those organisations say, yes, we do have relentless expectations, but actually unpicking that to go, actually, is this enabling performance? Is it creating some silence as well? It reminded me of a piece of work we did last year. Global business, they have a UK headquarters, a big manufacturing site, and they do a once a year survey, which is absolutely fine. And in their existence, it's always been this is great, get good feedback, good comments. This 1 year, the UK operations, I'm being honest here, the results almost fell off a cliff. And what they've done in response to this is brought in an external party like us to dig a little bit deeper to understand what's been going on. Now, this organisation had gone through a lot of change, and there was very little in terms of communication around change. There was a fear that the UK workforce was going to be cut, and created this echo chamber, if you like, around, oh, things are good, it's not looking good for us. Yeah. What I found really interesting, bringing it back to psych safety, is we got a lot of intel, a lot of data. We didn't have to prod and poke much, it all came out. But what was really interesting, because we had our flip charts and smelly pens and, you know, all of the good stuff. And what we found is at the end of the session, some of the more senior leaders actually said to us, can we take these flip charts, because we don't want anybody to see who wrote this. I said, oh, it hasn't got your name on and it only stays with us. They had zero trust, which I found was absolutely fascinating and floored me a little bit, because I thought, wow, they don't even trust where the flip charts are going. But anyway, that just made us think about, when you're talking about find the silence, looking for patterns, not just scores. This was a reaction to a perceived dip. Well, it was a dip. And what do we need to do to respond?
Yeah, and it's so interesting, because it seems like that pattern is being reinforced by leadership as well. If they're feeling that way, it's very difficult to for others to maybe feel differently about it as well, and that can kind of flow through. And it's yeah, it's an interesting example, definitely. Thanks, Scott. So I think yeah, there's just a few examples there of like where we might find those contradictions, and I'm sure you've all got your own, but again, it's just about looking for things that, you know, seem a little bit off and not right. And once we've done that, I guess once we've decided, you know, where there could be pockets of silence, we're not saying to you to sort of roll out this big program on how to fix psychological safety, the sort of the idea here is to sort of create those safe opportunities and any means to understand what's really going on. So this is what we mean by running safe listening experiments. So we're not talking here about collecting more feedback. It's about helping your leaders understand the climate that their teams are experiencing. And I think the most important thing sometimes is to start where trust already exists. So look for teams where you've got managers who are open to feedback, where trust is already reasonably strong, and maybe where leaders are a bit willing to experiment, and avoid starting in the areas where trust is most fragile. And this is simply because if the first experience of listening you have in an organization doesn't feel safe, then you're really reinforcing the very thing that you're trying to fix. So early success will build that credibility, both for HR and the process. And I do think we sometimes have that tendency to want to sheep dip everyone through a program and put everyone through the same thing. And I think that stems from our desire to have that fairness. But this is really about creating proof points that it's safe to speak and that something will happen as a result. So if you've got that kind of climate happening at the time, then sometimes it's best to start with those people who where you've got a little bit of trust to start off with. And the second thing about this is about asking about behaviours. Don't ask people directly about psychological safety. Most people are not going to describe their experience, apart from me and Scott, who might talk about kind of, and maybe probably Amanda. But most people will not use that language, but they will recognise the behaviours. And Scott, that's where the high and low components of the Be Talent model really fit in, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Nothing further to add.
Nothing.
Yeah. I'm doing what I promised I would do, which is keeping an eye on time, because as many people will know, I do like to talk, so I'm regulating and managing. But yes, let's keep going.
Both Vicky and I are proud. Okay, so things you can ask about then around those behaviours. So we don't want to see things in surveys like, do you feel psychologically safe here? But you can ask things that sort of generally touch around the area. So I feel comfortable raising concerns in my team, different viewpoints are welcomed. When issues are raised, they're taken seriously and we discuss mistakes and learn from them. Because again, it's those everyday interactions, not labels. But I'm not talking about just asking surveys here, definitely. This is, these experiments are not just roll out a survey and use a survey. It can be any listening activity that you're doing and interacting, and we'll share some of those later as well. And the third thing really is helping leaders interpret the signals, and this is often where it can fall down. So it's about how you interpret what you hear. So before we get into this with any leader, we're starting with those questions. What are we expecting to see? What are we expecting to hear? And that sets them up for success, really, so that after the listening, we can create that space afterwards to reflect. What surprised you? What might explain this? What conversations need to happen next? And it can take them from feeling a little bit defensive about some data points to and reacting to those data points to being, actually in control of that. And this is where we get into my laggards comment earlier. So returning to my earlier point about we start where there is a bit of trust. It might feel a little bit counterintuitive, but we're building on a well-trodden path here, which is used by product developers, marketers, because it is true that when we spot areas where we think psychological safety is lowest, or we spot those teams, our instinct is to dive in and start there. But if we borrow from this model, which is really about how people take things up over time, we know we don't start with our laggards, we start with our early adopters, and that's the people where we've got that kind of trust built up already, where we've got just enough trust for it to work. So you're not failing and reinforcing the belief that it's not safe to speak here. So it's about building proof points over time, not forcing participations and putting everyone through a programme. It's identifying where psych safety is lowest, where there's just enough for it to work, and that's how we move beyond spotting the silence to starting to change it in a way that'll stick over time. Because I think once leaders start to spot those and understand those signals, that's where they can really shift. And what I think is quite good about this is, instead of it being like an HR thing, it's like actually leaders, like peer to peer, where peers start to see, actually, oh, what are you doing in your team? I've noticed some improvements, what's going on over here? And they start to take interest, rather than it feeling like something we're enforcing on them. And that's when we sort of can move into, we've got that space where we can listen, and we're going to start surfacing what's going on. Then we can help our leaders to interpret what those signals might actually mean. And this is where we sort of step into your world, Scott, and become more of a coach, rather than telling. And we're not trying to tell leaders how to fix psychological safety. We're helping them see that every interaction that they have within their team, and this is daunting as a line manager as well, every interaction you're having is either reinforcing safety or potentially reducing it. So as it rises and falls, it's all about the signals that we're sending as leaders every day. And this isn't a new concept by any stretch. And I think one of the helpful things that I can relate this to is some of Brene Brown's work, when she talks about daring greatly, and as a leader, having that kind of strong back, soft front leadership, which is being really clear and grounded, but also open, human, and having that willingness to be vulnerable with our teams. Sorry.
No, that's all right. I'll come in here, Jen.
You come in here while I have a coughing fit.
Yes, go for it. Funny enough, right, and this wasn't timed this way, I actually had my coaching supervision this morning before this, which actually made us quite zen, actually, for this. But it was really interesting because in our, so it was a team supervision, Vicky and I and our coach supervisor, we were talking about actually the climate at the moment we're seeing across our client base is a more take up of coaching, and we didn't know what the reason was for that. And we had a bit of it. I was just distracted. For me, it says that have we got any technical issues? Can everyone still hear and see us okay? Otherwise, Jack, our technical, oh good, thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, these things do happen, but yeah. Anyway, what I was talking about was we'd seen a bigger request for one-to-one coaching, and I think what we can, you know, maybe bring some conclusion to is the climate at the moment. And people just wanting a safe space that we know is bound by confidentiality, just to share unapologetically, something that I think people find really difficult to do in the confines of the work construct. Does that? Do you know what I mean, Jen?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's actually really helpful, because one of the things that I'd added to this that we didn't go through was actually sometimes you might need to recognize that you need an external person to come in and help with that coaching. And it's not a failing at all. It's just about using the different tools that we've got at our disposal to help leaders in those moments. And sometimes in organizations, it's just, you know, you might need that extra support to have that extra layer of confidentiality just to get started. If you do have those good relationships with managers and leaders where you are maybe closer to them and you can coach some of those, I think some of the stuff is the really simple things that we they're the kind of the micro habits, the little things that leaders can do to incrementally improve safety, that we don't always think about. So might just be as simple as speaking last in a meeting and recognizing that as the hippo in the room, or the highest paid person's opinion, that can create bias and it can stop people from feeling safe to speak up. We can use tools that actively invite different views in, or dissent, as I like to say, but sometimes it works by just asking people if anyone sees this differently, but sometimes you need a little bit more structure to it, like appointing a devil's advocate or doing a pre-mortem, which is a kind of something our engineers use, where they think about, if this project's going to fail in 6 months' time, what are the components, or what will have gone wrong or might have gone wrong to have contributed towards that. And it gets people to think about things if we've really got teams who are not comfortable challenging and speaking up for some of those nice teams, maybe. Separating ideas from individuals, admitting that uncertainty and goes goes into Brené Brown's work as well, and closing the feedback visibly. And I think one of the things that we sometimes go wrong with is thinking that if we've got nothing to say, we don't say anything. And actually the reality is that, you know, if there is no update, that's still an update. So sometimes we sort of need to bring people into that. So yeah, these are super simple ideas, but they can be hard to execute consistently in practice as well. So our role is to sort of help leaders notice these moments, reflect on them, and try and make those small shifts in how they respond. So we're not going to start with everyone. We're thinking about those early adopters, maybe the ones where you've got that good relationship, where they've got that kind of trust there, testing a few behaviours, confidence, building that confidence and proof, and then expanding on it. It's not about getting it perfect. It's about helping leaders to sort of make better decisions in those everyday moments, to help whether people decide to speak up or stay silent. And then when those signals hopefully start to shift as a result of implementing those coaching behaviours, that's when we can start to see a real change in climate. So this is, you know, the next step is not to start thinking about, you know, just let's run a survey. It's about thinking about how do we keep listening in a way that really reflects what's happening in our organisation. So you need to think about your listening as a kind of a whole complex system, and not just the things that you can see on the slide there. So we're thinking about when you listen, where you listen, and how safe those moments feel. And we shouldn't be using technology to replace conversations. It's there to help protect and validate what organisations hear. It can sometimes be really useful where you do have low safety already, but you know, it's kind of those one-to-ones, go back to the one-to-ones, team meetings, town halls, informal. That's where they can be some of the most important moments for psychological safety. But they are kind of a little bit less structured. So it is good to kind of have some of those structured mechanisms in place as well.
That I find is there's some fantastic tech out there, right? All singing, all dancing. And when we're working with leaders and managers to help them conduct reviews, for example, a bit better, I get quite assertive when they say, look at the system, it's so amazing, it does all this stuff. And I say, okay, so how does the conversation go? You know, oh, well, you know, I ask a question, I type, and I say, oh, why don't we try it without the technology and just have a conversation? So yeah, a couple of questions, Jen, actually, I can see in the chat a little bit earlier for me to ask, but I don't know if she's still with us. What is an internal positivity bias? And then we had a question from Helen. What does town hall listening mean?
Okay, so town hall listening is just really like an all hands kind of listening. I've heard like a lot of organisations refer to it as a town hall, where it's basically getting the all of the company together. We call it a huddle, because we think we're, you know, little rugby players there, but we're just online. So it's called lots of different things, but yeah, essentially it's that kind of all hands communication. And then that internal positivity bias, it's just having that bias towards, you know, aren't we brilliant and don't we do things really well around here, especially thinking about that kind of customer experience, so not necessarily seeing the things that the customer might be experiencing, and sort of just, you know, giving ourselves a good pat on the back for doing a job well done when it comes to the customer experience. Has that answered that, do you think, Scott? Or
yeah, that was great.
Yeah, great.
Yeah,
great. The final thing I want to talk about, and we've talked about, you know, we're finding the silence, we're shifting the signals, we're building that rhythm. One final piece is we can't only listen when we think we're going to like what we hear, because this is where a lot of listening strategies fall down. And we put channels in place, we ask the questions, we create the opportunities, but then when the feedback feels a little bit uncomfortable, or if it's inconvenient, that's when, you know, it starts to signal again to the employee that actually my feedback isn't wanted on during the difficult times, so it's safer to stay quiet. So this is where we really need to start thinking about how we start to reframe this as a leadership responsibility, and not always having the perfect answer, but, you know, it's just about making sure that it's not seen as just a comms exercise, that this is all about a listening, a leadership behaviour. And I know there'll be people on the call that think, yeah, this happens to us all of the time. So what do we do about it if this happens? This is where we get a lot of resistance. So leaders might think it's not the right time, we're going through this, the organisation's too busy, let's wait until things are settling. And this is where our role needs to shift from a facilitator of listening to influencing that decision making. So we want leaders to sort of hear these questions. We want to reflect this back to them and ask if they want to postpone any listening, what signals are we missing if we delay? What decisions are we making without data? And what messages do we send if we're only listening when the conditions are good? And that will really help to shift the conversation from, do we want to listen, or what's the risk we're taking if we don't? And hopefully executives will start to see that listening is actually a decision intelligence, and it's not just, like I said, a comms piece. And people will notice, absolutely. Like, people aren't daft. They know if they're being, fobbed off with listening when sort of we're going through changing and things like that. So just to recap before we move on to part 2, we've covered quite a lot there, but the intention here isn't to leave you with more to do. It's trying to help you, give you just a simpler framework to think about it. So we're finding the silence, changing the signals, and listening in rhythm. So if you take one thing away from this section, find one team, coach one behaviour, run one check-in. And that's when we can start turning silence into safety. And I'm going to hand back over to Scott, because I think I'm
Jen,
voice with this.
Get yourself a drink. But what we have done is we've got some QR codes here, but you'll also get these on the slides, of course, for some things you can use if you're good with your QR codes. I did share Beat Talent by Zircon's psych safety white paper last time. This one, both are really good actually, because actually gives you more learning, but also more practical things to follow as well.